and welcome to Thursday Night Talk. This is a show where we discuss the week in Humboldt, the local issues, and the local personalities. I'm Talvi Freed, your local host, and I'll be here with you for the next hour. Our topic for tonight, not the happiest of ones, but we all go through it. Topic for tonight is grief and grief support here in Humboldt County. Perhaps you've lost a loved one and don't know where to turn. Maybe you're trying to tough it out. Maybe a friend is suffering and you don't know how to help. Where can one turn when they are trying to navigate the grieving process? Our panel may be able to help provide some answers. It's always the goal here. Right now we've got Autumn Spears, licensed marriage and family therapist who has worked as a grief counselor for over 10 years and current clinical director of Evolve Youth Services. Returning to TNT, their Thursday Night Talk, for those not aware. John Heckel, who in addition to being the Humboldt County Civil Grand Jury Foreman, also happens to lead a grief circle locally in the area for those seeking help in a group support environment. Perhaps joining us in a bit would be Michael D. Fratkin, MD, founder and lead consultant for fire and water consulting, palliative care specialist. Hopefully they join. If they're listening on the radio right now, please tune in. Please come on the show. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for being on the show. So let's start off with the basics. Because I like to pretend that I don't know anything and that a listener might be tuning in and not being aware of anything. And so the first question I have is, what is grief? And does somebody have to, because a lot of people talk about death and dying and that level of loss, but are there other types of grief out there? Like what is grief? Let's start with Autumn.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely say there's grief, is a collection of emotions that we feel following a big change in our life that typically has some losses involved. That can include death and dying, or that can include something like, a fire, your house catches on fire and you lose everything in it. And you lose a place to live. There's also, losing a job, aging. There's a lot of losses as we age, sometimes our independence. So that's, but of course, I think what we all think of when we hear the word grief is death. We think of death and someone that we love, we've lost through death.
Losing something we value. I think part of grieving is embracing that we value something, that we hold something dear, and we've lost something that we value.
That makes sense. That opens it up to quite a bit about it. Because I wasn't, just for a side note, but I was informed that somebody was like, oh, well, you're grieving a loss. And I'm like, but nobody died. And I just felt like I don't have any right to grieve. And so what does grieving look like? Because at that point, I didn't think I was grieving anything. And somebody was like, a therapist in particular was like, no, you absolutely are. This is why you're being reactive in this way. This is why you're seeing things in a bit more of a dark skew. So what does grieving look like for people? Like, what can it look like? What are the different forms of it? I
guess I could start with some of that. I think the first thing that comes to mind for most people is sadness. Obviously feeling very sad and down. It can look a little bit like depression, but it's different. A lot of times people will say, I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm losing my mind those first few months of grief, because you do forget to put where your keys are. Some people would say to me, I forgot to put the check in the bill when I sent it off. Lots of things that we, absent-mindedness can occur during that time. And of course, anger, irritability, easily irritated, a lot of different emotions. Guilt is one that comes up a lot. I think one that isn't talked about enough is anxiety. Anxiety is very much a part of grief, in my opinion, and definitely sometimes relief, right? After we watch someone we love, deteriorate from cancer, for example, there's a sense of relief when they pass because they're no longer in pain. That doesn't mean that you don't have all the other emotions alongside it. but there is a sense of relief. And sometimes people can feel guilty because they feel relieved. So I'll go ahead and hand it
There's
to you,
also,
John.
yeah, I just want to add, there's also the somatic aspects of grief, where there's a genuine feeling of it in your body. There is a somatic reaction to the emotions that you're feeling. So people oftentimes feel sick to their stomach, muscle ache. There are various somatic aspects of grief.
What does that mean? Say somebody out there is like, what symptoms can they look for in themselves to realize? Because I think part of getting help, which we'll get into that in a moment, though I want people to be able to identify it within themselves and others, because I mean, one of the first questions is, say you've lost someone. And I think it can be a very big chain reaction when somebody passes, be it, especially in my age group or even younger, sometimes older, suicides or drug overdoses, even horrible car crashes, the unexpected aspect, but it can really leave people in a bad spot. And there's almost this chain reaction where suddenly a lot more people are not taking care of themselves, not being healthy, and they're not aware that they're even really grieving, or they are, but they're just, it can be very hard to diagnose yourself or others. Like some people, I hate to say it, are naturally inclined to just bounce back really easily from things. But that doesn't mean they're not suffering. It's just that they can put on a good front face. So what would somebody look for specifically?
Well, I think that just brings up the idea that we don't talk enough about how grief is a traumatic event. It's trauma. So there's a trauma response. I think first what comes to mind is that it hits sort of our basic needs. So sleep, appetite, well, first of all, I'll back up for a moment. So our appetites can be affected very strongly. Some people just can't eat. Some people may overeat, typically can hit the extremes. The sleep as well. A lot of people can, talk about how they can't sleep, or they wake up in the middle of the night and then can't go back to sleep. Again, sleep's very disrupted. And then there's people that just don't want to get out of bed. That's a great place to distract, right? And be able to escape the overwhelming pain of grief. You want to add anything to that, John?
No, I think that it's unique to individuals. I think there's a danger in the linguistic tying to the word grief, right? Sometimes people find it difficult to use that word and to wrap themselves around that word, where if you open the conversation up with somebody and you use the word loss, then there's an easier linguistic way to get at feelings other than necessarily using the word, are you grieving? Sometimes somebody will say, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means to grieve. For many of us, it's not a common experience. So when you ask me, how are you feeling? How are you coping with grieving? I might say, I have no idea. So if you take the block away and use a different linguistic system to get at the communication and the talking to somebody, then that might be easier to touch what's really going on. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I do want to get into like the stages of grief, because I think there's a lot of myth surrounding it. People are like, oh, if you're at one point, you can't somehow go back to another point in it. So perhaps Autumn, you probably know the stages very well and probably have a chart in your office somewhere about it.
Well, first and foremost, I don't believe there are stages that we go through. It is fluid. It is something that, some people I've worked with never went through anger, for example, and other people stayed in the anger place for a while, or they went back to it. It's fluid. It's fluid, just like all of our emotions are. It's going to change. It's going to morph. I also want to add that, grief is very unique. The grieving process is very unique to each one of us. It's very individual. It's very unique to that relationship, the proximity in which you were to that person, how close you were, all those things matter, right? And then the age, like you mentioned a minute ago, Tavi, the age of the person, it might really impact us even if we don't know that person, because maybe they're the same age as us, or maybe they're the same age as our child. So I really wanted to add that unique piece, that we can talk about all of these symptoms that we might see, right, that are similar in certain people across the board, but it is so unique to each one of us. Therefore, that stage idea, going through stages, is, because people say, oh, I haven't been through the bargaining, or I haven't been through this, and then they think they have to, or something's wrong with them if they haven't. And I believe Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on her deathbed said, forget it. There's no stages. It's fluid. It's, I don't have her exact quote, but basically she was saying, never mind. Right. Yeah. Go ahead, John. I'm sure you have something to add.
Yeah, no, she changed her, she changed her own mind at the end of that process, after publishing all the books and talking about all the stages. And then at the end of the process, she recognized how unique it is and how fluid it is. And maybe the idea of outlining 7 stages is not such a good idea if people get hung up on that, right?
It's hard enough as it is without having to feel that way, right?
Yeah.
Right, which, like, grief is one thing, but I feel like the grieving process or grieving is almost a way out of the grief. And I mean, I know that's different. This is a question to put. Is there any, obviously there's not. If it's fluid, there's no time limits to grief and grieving. Though for some reason in my mind, grieving is like the process of not getting over things, not forgetting about people or what you've lost, but it is kind of a process of becoming a person who can cope more in the day-to-day despite the loss.
Well, I'm thinking of the DSM, right? And in order for Blue Cross Blue Shield to cover the therapy session, right, you would fill out the adjustment disorder, right? And the DSM will pay for, with your co-payment, for a number of therapy sessions around the idea of adjustment disorder. And the adjustment disorder could be retirement, it could be a divorce, it could be a death of a spouse. So the DSM at least recognizes the grieving process, but places it under the label of adjustment disorder, that you're adjusting to new conditions and you're having difficulty adjusting to the loss that you've experienced.
Yeah.
You brought up retirement, and I feel like even in a positive way, changes like jobs too can be a loss. Pretty much I feel like any major life change. And it's funny that people don't realize that that's a major life change. You're changing all of your coworkers or some status to become something else. And if you just can't cope, what do you, I guess we'll get into the services part now. Like, what outlets are there for people in Humboldt County specifically the realization that you're dealing with this, and that it's a little I hate to say, it sounds like grief and getting counseling would be having to admit that you're not able to deal with this on your own. And that can be kind of demoralizing for a lot of people, especially somebody who's very independent, or especially with retirement things where somebody's spent 20, 30, 40 years of their life doing something and being very self-sufficient.
But
like, how do you make it less demoralizing for them?
a lot of our experiences of grieving or adjusting don't catch us by surprise. We know we're going to retire. We know we're going to move and leave Humboldt County and change our location. We know that we're going through a divorce process. We know that we're caretaking someone who's dying. So it's not as if suddenly we wake up in the morning and grieving takes us by surprise. So I think we would probably both advocate for a conscious process of adjusting and a conscious process of grieving. And that involves taking care of yourself. That involves getting help and recognizing that you're going through a process that you don't have to do all by yourself, that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask friends and family or a therapist or your religious person, your minister at the church. It's okay to ask for help to go through that process. Sometimes I think when we think about grieving, we automatically assume it's this surprise thing that happens. But most of the grieving that we experience, we know ahead of time that we're going to go through that process. And we can prepare for that process. We can get help to go through that process.
You know, I would just really love for us to think about that it's okay if we're having a hard time. We're human. We're not perfect. We say that a lot in our culture, but we don't actually follow it up with it's okay to not be 100% all the time. It's okay to not be okay, right? And so I think I would really like to see us just start to, as a society, believe that it's okay to pick up the phone and ask a friend for help or call a therapist or go to a grief circle, whatever it might be, to go out and do a ritual with, you know, with a group out on the beach. You know, it can be anything. But it's okay. You know, I don't know anyone, myself included, especially, who just gets through life without any hiccups, right? Or who goes through big changes without needing some help or just admitting that it's hard. And I'm not doing that great with it. And every day is kind of a struggle, but I'm going to get through it. But, you know, I need some help. I just would just really like to see our culture get there a little bit quicker than we are. So I think the more we can just say that out loud, that it's okay. And I can say that about myself, that I need help. I'm a therapist, doesn't mean that I just cruise through life without any problems.
Yeah. I think recently in the last year, there have been a number of high profile athletes who have brought the issue of mental health to the fore, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for getting us to talk about this. We're still living in a culture where it is much more readily acceptable to talk about physical illnesses than issues that affect our hearts or our minds. And that's still, for many of us, that's still taboo.
So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion with John Heckel and Autumn Spears on grief. Thank you so much. I'll see you in just a moment. Welcome back to Thursday Night Talk. I'm your local host, Talvi Freed. I am here with Autumn Spears and John Heckel. We are discussing grief. And if you missed the last break, you can catch it replaying here on KCCH, right, on the radio station over the weekend as well, tomorrow night, and then also on YouTube, on TV, channel 12 over the weekend. You'll be able to see us, our bright, shiny, happy faces. I'm not sure if this is the happiest of discussions, but we are speaking about grief. What it is, what it looks like was where we left off. And I want to continue down that just a bit because Autumn, you seem to deal a lot with youth services. Well, John, I'm not exactly sure your demographic, but I'm assuming adult.
We're old.
Yeah.
People.
And so I kind of want to pose the question of does grief look different in different age groups, especially when you're dealing with children who don't have the years of learning the vocabulary to express themselves the same way somebody who has lived 10 times longer than them has.
Excuse me, it absolutely looks different. In children, it can look very different. Sometimes the only way children know how to express themselves is through their behaviors. So they will show us how they're doing. Sometimes not right away. I often hear that from families that, well, they seem just fine. They seem just fine. However, when I meet with a child, they'll tell me sometimes that they cry themselves to sleep every night. That's when they think about it, is at night when they're going to bed. Sometimes children want to protect the adults in their life. So say a child has lost a parent and the other parent, they're clearly grieving and the child wants to protect that surviving parent. And so they won't talk about it. They'll keep it to themselves and again, cry themselves to sleep at night. So sometimes, you know, we won't know that children are having a hard time until their grades start falling rapidly or they get in big trouble behaviorally at school or elsewhere. Sometimes, you know, children will also, like I would have a session with a child and, you know, they might share a little bit, but it's like snippets or it's sprinkled throughout the session is how I like to look at it. It's not like an adult, we sit there for a whole hour and we talk about it the whole time. Whereas a kid, we might play a game and then it's sprinkled throughout. They might just say like a sentence here and a sentence there, or they might express a feeling, or they might, you know, if they're really young, they might act it out in the play somehow. So it's going to look a lot different for children. And again, they don't necessarily stay with it. They're kids, so they can kind of come away from it and play like as if nothing, we didn't just talk about something, whereas as adults, we're really, you know, like you said, it's not the most uplifting subject. We're a little bit, you know, heavy with it, feeling pretty intense, maybe overwhelmed with emotion, whereas the kids can kind of bounce in and out of it. And again, I'm being very overgeneralizing. Not every child does this way, but that's, I would say, in general, what I've seen.
John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Me?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Well, I have
demographic.
questions. Do you do Santray work with the kids?
I have in the past.
You have in the past, yeah. I did 2 years of internships with Catholic Charities, and I worked with young boys that the court sent who were having gender issues and went through a lot of Santray and game therapy and stuff. And a lot of times that brings out all kinds of wonderful stuff.
It does. It's fantastic with any age, right? I love Santray.
What is the Santray method?
Do you want to explain?
Let's go into like some specific methods of what counseling would look like. Specifically, what's the Santray method? It sounds fun, to be honest.
Well, I can remember my first Santray experience when I went to school. I was overwhelmed. I couldn't pick up the things off the shelf to put into the Santray. But the Santray method is there is literally a Santray that is certain number of feet off the floor. It's a certain size, and there's sand in it, and you engage the young person. I've never done it with adults. It's been done to me. But in terms of working with boys or young people in general, you ask them, usually you have a collection of pieces animated pieces, plastic pieces. You have all kinds of, you got shelves full of stuff, and the child can go over and pick something up off of the shelf and place it in the sand tray, and they begin to act out stories in your sand tray. And then you silently and quietly witness the experience of the story that the child creates within the sand tray. And that can be phenomenally revealing in terms of what the child is going through. But you can talk more about, have you done the sand tray in relationship to grief work?
I have. You know, and it can look very different. Sometimes children will will actually play that out, you know, where there was a death or someone was sick or they're trying to help somebody, or they're a superhero coming in to try and help that person. To magically, you know, children up to a certain age have that magical thinking where they believe that they can go back and fix things, right? And so we'll see that sometimes. So it's not something I did a ton of with children, but I've definitely done it. And it's been really interesting when I have. Symbolically, it's very rich.
Yeah.
You had brought up magical thinking and that it's children up to a certain age. I can be very superstitious about the most random things. I don't think that's abnormal for adults to engage in that sort of thinking as well. Can you explain to everybody what magical thinking is and how it can affect grieving or grieve?
Yeah. So, I mean, with young children, they may believe that the person can come back, that they, you know, like cartoons, they die and they come back. So they might magically think that there's something that maybe they could do to make that happen, or it's just going to happen. Daddy will be back next week. Or they're watching the door, you know, hoping and wishing and magically thinking that. What I meant is then, you know, at a certain age, I believe it's 8 or 9, I just don't want to misquote that, but when we start to be more concrete in our thinking and we start to learn that there's a beginning to life and an end to life, right? It's not like the cartoons that we've watched. So, but what you're speaking to, Talvi, I just kind of want to jump to that because that's a different way of thinking, like magical thinking as an adult or superstitions, or I think of spirituality, right? Or faith, the religious faith. Sometimes people really need that to carry them through their grief, and that's really helpful. Whether that be, again, like Christianity or Judaism, or somebody who has Native American spirituality, who believes all things are connected and that there's still energy here. That person is just an energy being. It's not just Native Americans that believe that. There's plenty of different spiritual practices, right? So, so I think that comes into play, and that helps us. That can help us cope with our grief in many different ways, as many ways as we could all come up with times a million, right? John, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I in terms of like our death and dying group, and our death and dying group has been meeting for, I think, almost 4 years. We meet once a month. And I think the part of the motivation for creating it is this idea of a belief in the spirit or the energy of community, of what happens when people get together around a particular topic or a particular theme, and what happens when a group of 9 people focus their energy around someone who is in the dying process, in terms of finding a way to send that person energy. And then how does that feed back to the person who is grieving? How does that feed back to the 9 people in the group? And I agree, I think there's a combination of magical thinking, spirituality, certainly. I think one of our motives to create the death and dying group is that none of the 9 of us are conventionally religious in that we're not a Baptist or a Unitarian or a Catholic. So we don't have that language. Those religions have a particular language system that they use around death and dying. And it serves the people who are grieving within that system. But if you're not in that system, then you have to struggle with finding your own language system, your own rituals. We create our own meaningful rituals, right? So it's part spirituality, part magical thinking, and it's very much involved in the grieving process, right? We have to redesign it. We have to reconfigure it, something that works for us. And you asked earlier, what can people do? People can create their own groups. I mean, people can create somebody out there listening, thinking, well, that would be neat. All right. Start getting on the telephone or email people and see if you can form your own grieving group, your own death and dying group, or your own adjustment disorder group, right? So that you try to work this, you try to work through this with people that know you, people that love you, people that respect you, and you find your way through all of this with the help of other people.
Do you think for kind of a grassroots group to pop up like that, should there be some semblance of a professional involved? I feel like this is a really heavy topic, and to not have somebody medically trained to be able to see and spot like when somebody is going, not to say too far, but becomes too dark and isn't like there's things to watch, because I would be like, oh, I would love to create a group and talk to like-minded people and hear their stories and share that. But I worry about the liability of that, because what if I don't spot somebody spiraling down because everybody has a different way of presenting themselves and something happens to them? Like what?
I understand. It hasn't happened in our group. We have within the group, we have a diverse set of people. We take turns facilitating. We take turns at going to different people's houses or different locations. People come up with different topics. We share articles that we find. We share videos about the death and dying and grieving process with each other. And then when we get together once a month, somebody is hosting, somebody facilitates, and someone has an idea that they want to explore around the grieving process. And so far, everybody, it's worked. It's a commitment that you make to other people to be present with them. Personally, I don't think you need to have a professional facilitator for that.
I have to agree. I think you just, it's everybody knows in the group that it's a peer support type group, right? Yes. So that you're supporting one another. I think the most important piece is that you are supporting one another, right? Mm-hmm. And that they're coming together and you're not alone, because grief is a very lonely process. Yeah. It's a lonely journey. And so, even when you are with other people, people have said to me, I feel so alone, So I think, again, it can be, I've known of some groups in the way past that were facilitated by someone who wasn't a professional that may have gone off track. But I think what John's talking about, where people come together, like-minded people, they come together, they need some support. We do lack support, resources here and elsewhere as well, not just here. So I think that's the most important piece, as long as people come together and everybody agrees that that's what they're doing. There's also, there are groups that are therapy groups where you have to have a professional run it. There's support groups that are more like volunteers run it, but they probably have quite a bit of some sort of background professionally that helps, lend to that role. So again, I think it just depends on the type of group and how it's set up,
Mm-hmm.
So I've noticed that that John, it does seem like a much older crowd that you deal with, which to bring that back, because I feel like children grieve in their own way, but the world can still seem vast for them. And it's kind of the loss of things are just always going to be wonderful and magical with them. Though, I mean, to kind of paraphrase my father's statement, he informed me, he's like, I'm getting older, and the older I get and the older you get, the more you're going to lose people. And it's just a reality you're going to have to face. Though there comes a point when you're old enough that you also, like, mortality is inevitable, you know,
Right.
and I feel like anybody at any age can feel kind of like the loss of themselves, even though it hasn't happened yet. But there's a big difference between me being worried about being hit by a bus and somebody who's, you know, in 20 years, I'm going to be my age. In 20 years, somebody who's 80, you know, like, hopefully they're still alive, though there's a good chance they're not. And so what happens there? Like, what's the mentality of knowing that it's inevitable? Like, how do you even deal with the loss of yourself?
Well, what we're confronting a lot of that right now within the group, in terms of one of the members of the group. But one of the things that comes up is the difference between death and dying, and the confusion around that process, and the uniqueness of both of those. Dying is a process. It is difficult to grieve during dying. Dying is something that we get to share with somebody else. It's a shared process, right? We can be there when somebody experiences death, when they actually die. And at that moment, the grieving becomes easier. And in our group, we know that we're going to go through a shared process where we are going to share dying with each other. That's a recognition that's in the group. So the idea of exploring grieving is not an academic exercise. It's a very personal experience within the group, because we know that we're going to share the dying process with each other. And if we're fortunate enough, we'll be there at the moment that somebody dies. But you said earlier about the relief that someone feels if the dying process has been going on for a period of time, and then when somebody dies, there is a relief, because at that moment, the grieving becomes easy. I can commit to grieving, to fully being present with grieving. In the dying process, I'm torn between I can't grieve or I can grieve. I need to be supportive. I need to do this, and I'm not fully present with the grieving process. I think that's the relief. That's my interpretation of that relief that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think seeing someone we love in pain and suffering, or what we perceive as suffering, right? Sometimes we don't know because they might be unconscious.
Yeah.
I think is very, very difficult for a lot of people. I know it is for me. As a mother too, I want to help, right? Just as a human, but also that mothering part. And then, yeah, I think it is I think you really nail it, John, with it is, I'd rather grieve and see you pass, because then you'll be out of that suffering. And then I can handle my grief, but I can't handle this helplessness any longer.
Yeah.
For me, that's been the case.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's probably a good time. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with John Heckel and Autumn Spears discussing more on grief. You're listening to Thursday Night Talk. Welcome back to Thursday Night Talk. I'm Talia Freed, your local host. I'm here with Autumn Spears, licensed marriage and family therapist, also works as a grief counselor for over 10 years and current clinical director of Evolve Youth Services, as well as John Heckel, who, in addition to being on the Humboldt County Civil Grand Jury, as a foreman, leads a grief circle group locally, particularly focusing on death and dying, as we discovered the depths of that right before the break. If you missed the rest of the conversation, we'll be replaying this tomorrow at 8 p.m. right here on KZZH. You can also tune into channel 12 on Access Television, because this is all through Access Humboldt. Thank you to Access Humboldt. And just rewatch it over the weekend, though we are in the final 20 minutes of this, and I just wanted to touch base with both of you. Did you want to continue that discussion for a moment?
I need to say one thing, right?
Yes.
My term as foreperson of the grand jury is over.
Oh, that's right.
There's a new grand jury that has recently been impaneled, and Richard, really fine person, is the new foreperson of the new grand jury, and hopefully I wish the new grand jury a great deal of good wishes, and I hope they do a great job, and I'm sure they will. So I just wanted to say that. Richard, if he's listening, is going, no, he's not the foreperson anymore.
Well, it is a job, I guess, a job that you were great at, though. We do have another episode of Thursday Night Talk where we talk to some members of the civil grand jury, including you, about what has been released fairly recently too. It was though back to the topic at hand, which is grieving, and we've discussed lots of definitions, which I guess, John, you're going through a little bit of grief by not being on the civil grand jury. Probably that was a very intensive.
And it's an interesting process of how you connect, right? The grand jury used to meet on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so every Tuesday and Wednesday I would get into grand jury mode. And now when Tuesday and Wednesday comes along, there's both a relief and a kind of missing. So grieving also associates itself with places, with time, with clothes, with smells. There are so many sensory inputs that can trigger the grieving process, right? Because it really is a somatic process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I want to share one story. When I was ombudsman for Seaview, and to show you how we do grieving wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Their policy at Seaview, when someone passed, they would close all the doors, right? And they would take the body out, and there would be no official recognition that Martha in room 219 had died.
Wow.
That's how we screw up the grieving process in our society, how blinded we are, how the kind of mistakes that we make. We're literally an institution that's got 90 beds or whatever it is. There are 90 people in there, most of them at the end of their life. Most of them know that this is a place where potentially I'm going to die, and people are going to die around me, and end of life relationships are made between people in those skilled nursing facilities. And when somebody passes away, they close the doors, they take the body out, and there is no formal moment of recognition that so-and-so has passed. That's how screwed up part of that system of grieving is.
It is very messed up because we only have so much time left. Again, I always find at the during the end of shows, I'm like, oh, we have so much more to discuss. There is always so much more, though. I want to get into resources for people at this point, because talking about such a heavy such heavy discussions. I know there's support groups out there, though. What are the various methods that somebody can find something that works for them?
I'm going to just start with, I think something, I just want to say a few things to people who are grieving, and just to say to give yourself permission to grieve, and to go ahead and cry, go ahead and reach out to people, reach out to a therapist if needed, or go to a support group, write in a journal, go walk around the block, whatever it might be, participate in rituals, whatever that means to you. I know I was trying to remember the name earlier. Once a year we have the lighting. I think it's the Chinese lamps. Is that right?
The lighting ceremony. It was last weekend. It was a week ago.
And we do it here at the marsh too. Do you remember when we do that? Right? Was it just happened?
Yeah,
okay.
It just happened.
So that's a beautiful ritual to participate in, or anything, right? I mean, you could even gather a group of friends and go do something together that honors that person. And so I just wanted to say that to people. I just think that's important. So I called around today just to make sure I got some resources correct. So I called Hospice of Humboldt just to make sure that I was correct about their children's program is still in existence. It's the one that I created with a wonderful team of people. It's the Circle of Care Youth Program. Children can receive up to 26 sessions for free. Whether you are a hospice related, so you experienced a hospice related death, or a community related death, excuse me. So you can just call hospice. I believe it's 267-9801, that's 707 area code. And then for adults, you can also receive, if you're community, you can receive 3 free sessions with a counselor there, or hospice. If you're a hospice related, you can call and you'll find out how many you can receive through a counselor there. There's also support groups for adults that happen a few times a week. Also, their counseling is phone, Zoom, or online, or in person. So you can choose based on whatever your needs are and your preferences. There's also a grief hotline that's out of Contra Costa County. The number is 1-800-837-1818. That's as far as last time I checked, it's 24/7. People on there, wonderful people answer that line. There's also, of course, the mental health hotline now that's 988. If you find yourself in an emergency, need someone immediately to speak with, you're feeling like you might harm yourself, please don't hesitate to reach out and get some help. It's again, I want us to get away from that idea of it being just demoralizing. It's okay to ask for help. We're people. We need people. We need to help each other. For children, online, I just wanted to add a few online pieces. Let's see. I'll go that one in a minute. The Dougie Center is in Portland. They're online. They're wonderful. Great education. Great resources on there. There's the let's see, this one's not for children, but it's the MISS Foundation, MISS.org. That one is for neonatal death and infant death. There's not a lot of resources for that. The Cope Foundation, I think it's .org. It was a great website I found today. I hadn't found that one before, but it had multiple different resources on there available, from education to different groups that were available, etc. And then grief.com was another one. So for people that don't want to reach out, would prefer to be online for any reason, whatever reason, those are some resources for you there. And then of course there's private therapists here locally. You can find them if you go online to Psychology Today and you just put in like Eureka, California, or your zip code, and it'll come up a list of different therapists in the community. And then there's also excuse me, North Coast Association for Mental Health Professionals. So it's ncamhp.org. You can go on there, same as Psychology Today. So you can use either one of those. I found some therapists are on one and not on the other, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Let's see. There's also griefshare.org I wrote down as another one that I've known about for a long time. I believe that one's for free. Not all of them are free, so you kind of have to check that piece out too.
Mhm.
So those are some I wrote down for tonight.
I appreciate the research. John, did you have any more to add on to that?
Well, I want to make a plug for take it for the arts, and that is that there are ways that you can take your experience of grief, share it, and engage other people with that process. At the same time, honor the grief and find expression through the arts, whether that's through a writing group, whether that's through poetry, whether that's through storytelling, whether that's participating with soul collage or any of the number of the OLLI classes that are offered that explore artistic possibilities. But you can take the grieving process and take it and express it and work with it and be self-reflective about it with other people through the arts. And I just want to make a plug for that.
I appreciate that. We're sort of nearing the endish. I wanted to thank you both, of course, though I feel like everything being said today is kind of part of what needs to be done as a society, which is acknowledging and honoring grief, as well as John, you had mentioned how I felt like that's rude to just be like, let's shut the doors on somebody and walk their body past without acknowledging that that's a human being and that's a life lost. I do hope to do a show on death and dying at some point in the future, because I think that's a whole topic on it in and of itself. Yes, John.
Real quick, one thing that we haven't touched on, right? And in terms of grieving, and that's social media. And that's the how do we find out about our loss, right? In the old days, there would be some kind of personal contact that might be made. You might read the obituaries that would indicate some kind of personal loss. But the grieving process has an adjustment to make with social media, because we're now reacting and discovering about our losses on TikTok or Facebook or wherever. And that's a whole new issue in terms of grieving. How do we grieve in an age of social media?
That is valid and interesting. And I think that's one too with time, because that's a whole new therapeutic study that needs to be done. Because it's true. It's sometimes I'm like, oh, look at all the cat photos, and suddenly like some heart-wrenching news hits me, and I don't. It's kind of shocking sometimes. It really does shock the system. This is why I refuse to check my phone during work, because I can't face the fact that I might hear something absolutely awful.
Are you still doing Facebook?
Yes.
Okay, so let's say you got 500 friends, right, on Facebook, right? So I'm 76 years old, and because I'm a retired professor, I got all these students that I'm connected to, right? I got 600 friends. 45 of them are dead.
Yeah.
45 of my Facebook friends are dead, right?
Right.
But they still exist. They still exist in social media.
So strange. It is very strange. So we are in round robin territory now. So you each have about 2.5 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, just to let people, whatever you want listeners or viewers to walk away with. Let's start with Autumn.
I just wanted to add one more piece to the social media part, is that sometimes, I hear that piece of it for sure. And I also wanted to add that it's also a place for people to memorialize loved ones they've lost, right? And so it's also like an open journal for some people that can be very healing. And it can be maybe jarring for other people to see that sometimes when you open your Facebook or something, but I did want to just add that it can be a healing space for people too, I think, when done a certain way. The part that I think I would like to touch on at the end here is, how do I support people who are grieving? How do I support this person, this really good friend of mine who's has had a big loss recently? What do I do for them? So often I would hear people say to me, people in their lives would say, it's been so many months, you need to move on. What's going on? You need to get over it, encouraging people to get over it and move past their pain, which is impossible. We were saying grief process earlier, but I believe it's a journey, and I believe it's a lifelong journey, especially relationships that we hold dear to us and that are very, very close, and that also rock our world when we lose them. I want to say, to just be mindful of your words. I'm not going to give you a list of things you should say. I feel like people have their own language and their own personalities, and they can do that on their own, but just to be mindful and think about what would I like someone to say to me when I'm in pain? What do I need someone to say? Or really think about what you're saying before you say it. So kind of run it through your mind first and think, is that going to be offensive, or is that going to be hard to hear? There's a handout that I've had for many years, and I used to give it to people, to families, because I would go into homes and there would be someone really grieving the loss in a huge way. And then maybe a sister, they're saying, my sister doesn't get it. She thinks everything's fine. So I would just simply leave this handout sometimes for people in the home. And it says support looks like, and it's in the middle, and then it has all these different ways we can support someone. So I'm just going to read a few of those real quick. So compassion, it can look like a tea for two, just going out to have a tea or a dinner. Helping them with something. Maybe they need some help around the house, especially like an elderly person, they've lost their partner. Checking in and saying, can I mow the lawn for you? Can I bring you some lunch? Also, saying, hey, I'm going by the store. What can I get for you? Not, what can I do for you? That's open-ended. Sometimes we just don't know how to answer that when we're going through a big time, really hard time. So offering assistance, showing up physically and mentally, and that can look like all kinds of different things. Being authentic, being open, being empathetic, just being there, just going and just sitting and listening, and not correcting or saying, you already told me this 6 times, because that's a big part of grief, is processing maybe sometimes the same thing 16 times. Words of encouragement, simply a smile, being there and hugging them. So, and just being a good friend, whatever that means to you. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Autumn. John, you have about 2.5, 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if Autumn needs another 60 seconds, I'll give her 60 seconds. No, but I'd specifically like to address this issue of talking to older people. I'm 76, soon to be 77 years old, and have dealt with issues around aging and death and dying for a while in terms of the grieving process. And I would encourage, there was a recent study that was released that more and more old people are living by themselves, that the number of older people that are no longer in couples, that are living by themselves, is increasing dramatically, and it's frightening, and we have to do something about that. So I would encourage those people that are fortunate enough to be able to be extroverted enough to form support groups, to form neighborhood groups that support each other, and that can create and host a group of 6 or 7 people, elderly people, that get together and talk about all of the things that they're grieving about the loss of their knee that doesn't work anymore, or having to go to dialysis every other week, or whatever it is. There are enough extroverted seniors that if they step forward and find a way to engage other seniors to form support groups, so that the grieving becomes a communal process and not a private process.
Thank you so much, John. That's all the time we have today. Autumn Spears, licensed marriage and family therapist, grief counselor for over 10 years, clinical director of Evolve Youth Services. Thank you very much. John Heckel, former foreman for the Humboldt County Civil Grand Jury as well. You lead a grief circle locally, and I appreciate both of your contributions to this show. Not an easy one. We'll be replaying Thursday Night Talk, this particular episode, Friday evening at 8 p.m. right here on KZH 96.7 FM. You can also watch the show on Access Humboldt's YouTube channel. Just search Access Humboldt. There's even a playlist called Thursday Night Talk, as well as on Channel 12 throughout the weekend. I believe at least once a day, every day until Tuesday or something like that. I'm your local host, Talvi Freed. I'll be back next week with another interesting topic that we get to explore together. Have a great weekend, everyone.